everybody, and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today, we're going to be talking about the fossil record. We've already talked a little bit about fossils and the fossil record already when we were talking about natural selection, and we were talking about evolution. But we haven't really talked about paleontology, and we briefly touched on geology, and that was mostly for continental drift. So paleontology is the study of fossils or extinct organisms. And so most of you, again, are aware of, what a fossil normally looks like, right? But plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, they all form some form of fossil. Generally speaking, we're used to just things with bones, forming a fossil. But plants can form like these imprints of their leaves or of their stems or of their flowers or whatever that might be. Fungus, same thing. Bacteria leave these little tiny like bubble kind of fossils behind. And something to keep in mind is that only a very tiny percentage of organisms are ever fossilized because the conditions have to be right for fossilization. So even though we have found tons of extinct creatures, right, and we have, remember, on our phylogenetic trees, we have these hypothetical common ancestors that we are still like, hey, one day we'll find them. It's possible that they don't exist. And it's not that they never existed. It's that, maybe it just never fossilized. The conditions weren't right for fossilization. And so what does it require for fossilization? Well, for things with bones, it requires a rapid covering of something in sediment or tar or ash, or they could get caught in a bog, technically, right? So fossil formation takes a long time, and the conditions have to be such that it happens very, very quickly. It's kind of like when Mount Vesuvius erupted, right? We've found preserved remains of, exactly what people were doing when that volcano erupted and those people got covered in ash. Same thing. We can technically see organisms that were either in the middle of laying eggs or were in the middle of digesting something or in the middle of fighting something, if, they got covered rapidly enough. So how can we date fossils? Well, there are many different methods. The easiest one, right, is relative dating, which is just comparing organisms in the rock layers themselves. So, if we know the age of this rock and we know the age of this rock, we can estimate the age of the rock in between. And so that's called relative dating because you're literally comparing, your rock layer that you're looking at relative to two other rock layers. And the law of superposition says that younger rock layers are deposited on top of older rock layers. So the further down we go, the older the fossils should get. But this doesn't really give us a definitive answer, right? How do we know how old these rock layers are, though, right? Because for relative dating, it, requires that we at least know the ages of the rock layer above and below it. And then for the law of superposition, same thing. It doesn't tell us how old they are. Well, we use radiometric dating. And so that is, using radioactive decay. So, certain isotopes have a certain number of neutrons that will make them a little bit unstable. And from that, we can get exact ages. And when I say exact, the reason why I put them in quotes is because there's always there are always error bars involved when we're doing radiometric dating. And so, if you're dating something millions of years old, it might be give or take, tens of thousands of years. And that sounds like, oh, wow, that's crazy. But in the scheme of things, it really isn't because we're looking at something that's millions or hundreds of millions of years old, right? So radioactive dating methods. Rocks contain a number of elements that can change into other elements because they have a different number of neutrons, and so they are unstable. And so luckily, that's something that you'd learn in chemistry anyway, right? But that's something that we have tabulated and have, actual information on. We know the half-lives of every element, and every isotope of every element. And we know what those half-lives are and what they manufacture, depending on what type of decay they're undergoing. And so a half-life, which I've kept using over and over and over again during this explanation, is the amount of time it takes for half of the original element to decay. And so for something like carbon 14, this is what a curve for, kind of the percentage remaining of carbon 14 and how old then that item would be. Um, and carbon 14 turns into nitrogen 14 through beta decay. So this is kind of what we're looking at. We're looking at like a graph, and based on how much carbon 14 there is remaining left inside of that item, we can figure out how old it is relatively, right? And so all we really need to do is to compare the amount of the original element that's left to the new element that you made, and you can calculate the age of the rock that way. Um, some of them are, way more useful than others. Uranium 238 turns into lead 206, and that takes a very, very, very long time. Um, and so, in extremely old rocks, this might be a really good way of figuring out how old that rock is, and therefore how old that rock layer is. Potassium 40 turns into argon 40. And so, again, that takes a particular length of time that might be extremely useful to us as a result. So, if you have any questions, please let me know.